Buenos días, señor gobernador. Mi nombre es Raimundo Pérez Hernández y soy el director general de la Fundación Ramón Areces, en nombre de cuyo patronato les doy a todos ustedes la más afectuosa y cariñosa bienvenida. No puedo olvidarme tampoco de Miguel Sebastián, amigo y colaborador de esta fundación desde hace muchísimos años. Un agradecimiento muy especial al Observatorio del Banco Central Europeo y al Banco Central Europeo por haber confiado en la Fundación Ramón Areces para la coorganización de este acto. Y muchísimas gracias también a los equipos organizadores del Observatorio del Banco Central y de la Fundación Ramón Areces, que se han esforzado porque tenga lugar un acto de candente actualidad que concita, creo yo, una reflexión profunda sobre las consecuencias tanto económicas como monetarias o financieras de dos eventos que han sacudido la solidez institucional, como son la pandemia y la guerra de Ucrania. ¿Quién iba a decir que íbamos a sufrir una pandemia como la actual, por cierto, aún no terminada, que ha puesto en jaque la capacidad de reacción sanitaria de todos los gobiernos? ¿O quién iba a decir que iba a estallar un conflicto bélico en el este de Europa que ha resquebrajado toda la arquitectura europea de seguridad y que puede tener repercusiones incluso mucho más allá de las fronteras europeas? Las implicaciones, efectos y consecuencias de estos acontecimientos son el apasionante tema de hoy. Disfrutemos todos de esta oportunidad. Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra el señor gobernador del Banco de España.
Well, I will move into English. Good morning, everybody. So let me, of course, start by is named, I guess you know, after Germán Bernàcer, a very prominent Spanish macroeconomist with a deep understanding of monetary theory, who became head of the Bank of Spain Research Department in 1930. The award was instituted to foster research on macroeconomic and financial issues by economists from the euro area under the age of 40, and since its inception, the Bank of Spain has collaborated with the Observatorio del Banco Central Europeo in organizing the award ceremony. But perhaps the most important element I wanted to emphasize is the fact that the organizers of today's conference, drawing exclusively from the ranks of past Germán Bernàcer Prize winners and selection committee members, have been able to assemble such an impressive lineup of prestigious economists and policymakers, which I guess is a good demonstrates perfectly the vision of the creators of this prize and the excellent selection work carried out over 2 decades. Indeed, the selection of speakers for this first session, which is the one I'm going to comment a bit on the personalities only, not on the substance, is, from my own personal perspective, particularly fortunate. With Otmar Ising and Philip Lane, we will not only have the opportunity to hear firsthand from first and the present chief economists of the ECB, but also from the two, in my view, intellectual leaders who have made the most substantial contributions to the development of the ECB's monetary policy strategy since the creation of the euro. The latest review of our monetary policy, which lasted almost 18 months and was finished in June last year, was a profound soul-searching exercise that, among other things, allowed us to rediscover the excellent groundwork laid out by our predecessors, in particular by Otmar. As explicitly acknowledged by President Lagarde, this meant we could embark on evolution rather than on revolution. And let me thank personally here in public to Otmar for putting the foundation of the ECB. I've done this in private many times. but it is probably the first time that I have the opportunity to do this in public. So thank you, Professor Isse. Here, the adage that great minds have the advantage of standing on the shoulders of giants has never seemed more appropriate. And with the hindsight of time, I wonder what Omar really had in mind 20 years ago when he was chairing the selection committee of the Bernàcer Prize and chose Philip Lane as the first prize winner. But let me also talk about Professor Goodhart. Having Professor Goodhart with us is also very fortunate, of course. His merits and academic achievements are too numerous to mention in a reasonably short space of time. But following this thread of recognizing those who have preceded us, let me single out one of his books, The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, A History of the Early Years, 1974-1997, as a work to which me personally, owe an intellectual debt. As current chair of the Basel Committee, I and my colleagues are sometimes tempted to think that we currently face unprecedented challenges due to technological change, business model disruptions, complexity, and interconnectedness, among others. But after carefully rereading Professor Goodhart's penetrating account of the history of the Basel Committee, a different panorama is unveiled. The flow of history is more apparent, and the deeper trends underlying the evolution of the international financial system become clearer. The need for proper context and correct framing, including historical perspective, is essential for robust policy making, and that, I would say, is precisely the leitmotif of Professor Goodhart's research agenda. Let me also mention Professor Moll. I have already had the opportunity of praising his academic achievements and contributions to science and at the ceremony held when he was awarded the Bernàcer Prize. That was almost 4 years ago. At that time, I had barely a few months of experience as a young new governor, and Benjamin at that time was still considered a promising young European economist. I'm quite sure that few people would still consider us young today, but clearly we are now both somewhat more seasoned. All in all, perhaps 2018 was not such a bad vintage after all. But let me now focus, of course, on our keynote speaker, a leading policymaker, an outstanding economist, a colleague, a friend, and the winner of the first edition of Germán Bernàcer in 2001, Philip Lane. Let me take this opportunity to publicly express my gratitude to Philip for his intellectual leadership. Since joining DCB's executive board in 2019, his influence has been crucial in guiding our policy through these difficult and extraordinary times. His authority is based on what I admire most, rigor and example. And this is not by chance. It is a combination of personal character, perseverance, and a constant quest for excellence throughout his fruitful career. Philip studied economics at Trinity College in Dublin, where he graduated in 1991 with first-class honors and a gold medal. As pleasant as Dublin is, he set off that year for Harvard University, where 4 years later he received his PhD in economics. He then became assistant professor of economics and international affairs at Columbia University before returning to Trinity College in 1997. Philip's research focused on international economics, financial globalization, and economic growth. His work was published in top journals, and still today, according to the IDEAS REPEC ranking, he's among the top 1% of authors by number of citations. But let me mention one element of Philip's recent academic contribution, which I think is a good example of where he has been pursuing during the last decade or so of his work, which is this piece of research that, together with other renewed academics, and including, by the way, 3 other Germán Bernàcer Prize recipients, Markus Brunnermeier, Ricardo Reis, and Stein van Nieuwenbrug, well, in this piece of work, Professor Lane put forward a very influential proposal for the creation of a European safe asset. A proposal that later on he tried even to put it in public and to put in effect when he was chairing the Advisory Technical Committee of the European Systemic Risks Board, a position, by the way, on which I had the pleasure, the honor to substitute him. As a recognized scholar, Philip Lane was appointed director of the International Macroeconomics and Finance Program at the Center for Economic Policy Research. But Philip is not only an outstanding academic economist, he has also become a leading figure in central banking, In November 2015, he was appointed governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, thus becoming a member of the ECB Governing Council. And as I mentioned before, since June 2019, he has served as a member of the Executive Board of the ECB and as the institution's chief economist. In that position, he's playing a decisive role in shaping the ECB's response to the economic consequences of the pandemic crisis and the Russian invasion of Ukraine more recently. Philip's intellectual leadership has been essential to navigate these very turbulent waters. In his position as the ECB's chief economist, Philip has been a central figure in the conduct of economic policy in these difficult times, standing out as an example of professional excellence and personal kindness. I think Europeans owe him a debt of gratitude for his toil, as indeed we all owe a debt to those preceding us. So thank you very much, Philip, for being here in Madrid today. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Pablo, for those very kind words. I was so honoured and pleased to receive the invitation to come back to Madrid for this 20th anniversary event. Let me thank the Foundation for hosting in this wonderful building. Let me thank the Observatory for organising this prize over the years, especially Immaculata, who was so kind to me when I originally won the prize 20 years ago. And of course, there's now a community of former prize winners, and it's a very nice infrastructure for European economics. On the prize, let me give my current perspective as a policymaker. That really, because I know it takes a lot of effort by the Observatory, by the committee, by the sponsors to maintain this. But by recognising academic research in European macrofinance, from a policy point of view, I think it's very important for two reasons. One, directly, absolutely, the policy world studies closely the outcome of academic research, so there's a direct impact. But it's very much an indirect impact because, of course, the staffs of national central banks, other policy organisations are influenced by the research and also, of course, by the training, whether direct training or through mini courses here in SEMFI and other places by the prize winners. So I think it's a very, at this point, has built a very strong reputation, and I think it's been a great innovation. Of course, I'm self-interested as being one of the recipients. Let me also mention that it basically lines up with the history of the euro, these 20 years. And I think that's many of the prize winners have been very important contributors on different dimensions. And that's not just, of course, about monetary economics, it's about the architecture of the euro area, as Pablo mentioned in just one example. I'm especially delighted this morning that today Otmar Issing and Charles Goodhart from the original committee are involved in this event today. And it was so exciting at the time to be able to meet the founding chief economist of the ECB. And Otmar, throughout that period when I was an academic, I think we saw each other occasionally, and he's always been so open and so interested in engaging with the academic world. I think that's very important, and I hope I'm trying to follow his example. And absolutely, as Pablo mentioned, step one in the new strategy review at the ECB was that Christine Lagarde sent all governing council members a copy of Otmar's book on the founding of the euro. And that book, which explained all the issues that had to be sorted out in 1998 and thereafter, and also in the review in 2003, was essentially did most of the work. In our 20-year review, most of the 20-year review saying, yes, this remains the case. It remains the case that this is the correct way to organise monetary policy at the ECB. But of course, we also took into account the updates in the literature, in what we've learned over those 20 years. So it was tempting today to think about that 20-year horizon, what do we know now compared to what we knew then? But actually, in the end, I decided, look, the world right now, there's a lot going on, and I'm better off today trying to give an overview about our line of thinking about current events, as opposed to doing the academically interesting but maybe more remote historical review of the last 20 years. So I don't have a clicker here, so someone's going to move the slides for me, I'm guessing. Okay. Okay, perfect. So let me start off with the just an update about where we are. And of course, it's very important to take account of the pandemic shock. So the left chart here basically scales everything to 100 in Q4 19, so before the pandemic. And this is for the EU area. The picture is quite different for the US. It's quite different for the world economy. But for the EU area, what do we see? The blue line is GDP, and what we see is there was a big dip in 2020, but by now GDP is back to its pre-pandemic level. Not the pre-pandemic trend, because of course we should have expected the European economy to grow in those years, but it is an important metric to say we're back to the pre-pandemic level. However, this should not be seen as some kind of spontaneous recovery. It very much reflects policy choices. And one of those policy choices has been that to give a big role for fiscal policy. So you see the green line is government consumption and investment, basically the size of the public sector. And that's about 5 percentage points above its pre-pandemic level. So this is a big expansion of the public sector, whereas the private sector it has still not recovered to the pre-pandemic level. Consumption has nearly recovered, but investment is well below the pre-pandemic level. So we do not have a fully restored economy, and the fact that we are back at the pre-pandemic level does reflect a big public sector expansion. This understates the role of fiscal policy, because of course a lot of fiscal policy was support to households and firms, which is not counted. It only would operate indirectly through consumption and investment. Okay, so that's what's happened in the last couple of years. Then on the right side, I show you the latest forecasts from the Commission. We forecasted in March, the Commission forecasted more recently, so let's use the most up-to-date numbers. And last autumn, before the war, the projection was that this year would be another strong recovery, where the European economy would grow at 4.3, and then again next year above the typical numbers. What's happened is there's been a big downgrade, primarily because of the war and high energy prices. So that the European economy is still expected to grow, because there's still a momentum of recovering from the pandemic. But if you focus on the revision, to knock off 1 percentage point of GDP for this year is a pretty big revision in the outlook. So let me, this basically tells us the same story, but let me focus on that. So employment looks quite similar on the left. So in terms of number of jobs, the public sector has expanded, and the fact that the overall economy has recovered, it's public sector, industry and construction to some extent, but market services is still catching up, because the European economy has not yet fully reopened. Hours worked is more dramatic, because of course many people kept their job, but were put on short-time contracts. So in terms of the kind of nature of what's underpinning the economy and what might support the economy in the coming years, the left side shows you the household savings rate, where the horizontal orange line is the historical average, which is around 12.5% of income. So Europeans typically saved about 1/8 of their income. And in the pandemic, because of course we were stuck at home, the savings rate went very high, and it still remains above the pre-pandemic level. because again, it's not been a normal economy. People have not been able to take holidays, do many things. And the European Commission projection for this year and next is basically still a little bit elevated, or at most returning to normal. So in other words, what that means is there's a big accumulated stock of savings, which should mean, first of all, that the ability of European households to cope with the high energy prices is more than normal. And also over time, this will allow greater consumption and support the medium-term prospects for the economy. On the right side is the financial position of corporates. And the 2019 is a normal year, and what this says is normally firms make some money. The dark blue line is basically retained earnings. And they use it to finance investment and, yes, hold a little bit of cash on the balance sheet. 2020 was very different. Firms were making losses, but their balance sheet was able to be maintained through two reasons. One is the banking system provided a lot of credit. A lot provided, of course, under guarantees, public guarantees. And then there's a lot of direct fiscal support for firms, many types of subsidy schemes. So corporates have come out of the pandemic in not terrible shape collectively. So again, the fear that we would have a legacy of firms which were damaged by the loss of revenue has been mitigated by a lot of fiscal support and support from the banking system. So this is what underpinned the pretty high growth rates that were in the autumn forecasts or any pre-war forecast. Now, of course, with the war, we have the concern both through the effects of energy prices, but also the effects of geopolitical uncertainty on the future of Europe. Is if you look at the indicators, confidence indicators, you get basically a picture where right now, as in current activity levels, more or less the European economy looks okay because of the fact there's a lot of recovery from the pandemic. It's only in the last couple of months that we've more fully reopened the European economy. Lots of bottlenecks, which were there last year, some of those bottlenecks are improving. So firms are producing, which could not produce last year. On the other hand, the forward-looking indicators are not so great. So the new orders in the middle panel have plunged more, and some of these indicators have gone below the kind of 50 neutral territory. And you see that also on the right side, a plunge, but in that case, still above 50. And then we look at other indicators of expectations. At the start of the war, there's a big plunge. You might be optimistic and say, well, it hasn't got worse. It's not a kind of spiral situation. These indicators have stabilized, but they're basically stabilizing around the low levels at the start of the war. It's not the case that the war has been eliminated from these series. So, and households are also seeing this. So in a world where everyone's a little bit nervous, it makes sense that there might be a weaker economic performance. Okay, let me turn to inflation, which is, of course, is our number one focus at the ECB. So what I show here is an important element of what the ECB looks at, which is our inflation forecast. Remember, monetary policy only works with a lag. So we tend to say, well, what's the inflation dynamic a year from now, 2 years from now? And what I show here is the end of our forecast horizon, which is basically 2 years. And before the pandemic, we had a situation where inflation we thought was settling around 1.7, 1.8. So not quite at the 2% target where we would be more comfortable. And at the start of the pandemic, there was a big downgrade. We saw at the start of the pandemic the prospect of a big drop in GDP, which we thought would mean much weaker inflation pressure. So for headline inflation, our 2-year ahead forecast, which in 2020 was for 2022, dropped to 1.3, and core dropped below 1. So at the start of the pandemic, our concern was already inflation was weak. We thought it was going to get weaker, and therefore we needed a monetary policy response. And what's happened in recent times is there's been a revision to that. We think the underpinnings for inflation have gone up, but in the medium term, it's still converging to around 2%, which is our target. So there's a distinction between this medium-term perspective, which basically thinks inflation is going to be higher than before the pandemic, but basically in a limited way and in a way that's consistent with our target. So let me go to actual inflation. And so actual inflation is the blue line, and in 2020, as we feared, it went to around zero. The number for 2020 was 0.3, so close to zero. And in some quarters there is negative. Then if you look at, during the course of 21, initially it rose as the economy recovered, and rising to around 2% in the first half of 21 was, if you like, a little bit encouraging. Okay, that's where we wanted to go. But since the second half of 21 to now, it's just continued to climb. So the blue line has climbed from around 2% in mid-21 to nearly mid-sevens now. So of course this is far above where we want it to be, and of course it's a huge topic. Over that time it's led to revisions. So the dotted lines is our revised projection of inflation, and you see every time we said, okay, this high inflation is not going to disappear immediately. But we do think over a year or two, it is going to revert back to 2%. And that's the history of our revisions. And in March, we still had this revision, but much slower. So the time period where inflation would be above 2 would last for longer, but still converging to, in fact, a nudge below 2%. So that's what we've been studying. Now, the composition is very important because we do think it's important to take into account where is this coming from. So there's two charts here because of the scale of the energy shock. So over the last year, April to April, energy has risen by nearly 40%. Energy is about 10% of the price index. So 40% times 0.1 gives you 4 percentage points of inflation on its own. So if you think of inflation about mid-sevens, 4 of that is just from energy. But please remember, when energy prices go up, it pushes up prices across the economy because every sector uses energy as an input. So then when we look at the right chart, which is now on the same scale, inflation is above 2 everywhere. Food is over 6, and remember food uses a lot of energy, fertilizers and so on. Core is around 3, and it's high for goods inflation. Remember, goods inflation for a long time was around 0 because of technological improvements, globalization, and services inflation, which is normally the strongest component of inflation, is less elevated but still above 2. Now, what's very important to think about is the assessment, and again, this is not my assessment, it's the assessment of the external world. So we surveyed the experts called the Survey of Monetary Analysts outside the ECB, and their assessment is basically what we've seen is, over the last year, a very big inflation shock. So it's important to think about, this is unexpected, it's a shock. We were not forecasting a 40% increase in energy. And their assessment in April was, this shock is going to continue to play out for another year. So for the next year, mid-22 to mid-23, the inflation momentum will still be high, less, but still between 3 and 4. But after that, so about 1 year from now onwards, it'll be around 2%. So under that analysis, we basically have a 2-year episode. Year 1 has already happened of very high inflation. Year 2, the adjustment ongoing, second round effects, other effects still playing through. But after that, after another year, we'll be more or less at the target. To capture the scale of the energy shock, in the European context, it's important to recognise energy has a big imported component, and collectively, if we have to hand over more of our income to the rest of the world who supply us with oil and gas, there's basically less money available at home. So it raises prices and reduces income at the same time. That's not true in the United States, which is more or less balanced in energy. So there are winners, not just losers from high energy prices. In Europe, there are only losers in a collective sense. So one way to capture this is the trade balance for goods was around plus 3 percentage points of GDP. Now it's nearly minus 2 percentage points of GDP. So that's handing over more and more income to the rest of the world. Good for them, but it's a collective drain on the European economy. Now, to emphasize the point that the energy shock doesn't just show up in the energy component, the left side shows you the dynamics of goods inflation, which is around 3 percentage points now, when historically it's been very low, it's been around 0. But we think about 1 percentage point of that is coming from a mix of energy, because every sector is paying more for energy, and also for bottlenecks. So various goods sectors have been limited by bottlenecks. The bottleneck pressure will fade over time because those bottlenecks are getting solved and will get solved. The right side shows the services inflation, and where the service inflation is high is those sectors that are reopening. It's airplanes, tourism, hospitality, which again we think is a reopening effect. It's not a kind of a permanent inflation effect. Okay, so that's saying, well, we think there's been this pandemic reopening effect, bottlenecks, and the war, which are all kind of episodes. They're not here forever, but they push up inflation initially. But under that narrative, it's an unwelcome episode, but essentially it will ultimately fade away. So what might mean it won't fade away? And what means where it won't fade away is if we saw a situation where it kind of shocked the European system into a new world, where it was assumed that inflation would remain high. This is essentially the 1970s fear that some initial shocks, like the oil shocks, changed the way the economy worked and got us into a high inflation trap. So do the people who study inflation think we're going to go into a high inflation trap? So what I show here is the survey of professional forecasters. The blue line is what they felt a year ago, which is basically what they felt for many years, which is most of them felt that inflation would settle down around 1.5, 1.6. So there's a concern that we were permanently going to fail to meet the 2% target. There's many articles about Europe turning into Japan, having a long-term low inflation problem. Now, by the start of last year, they had changed their mind, or start of this year, I should say, they changed their mind, which is the yellow line, which basically says, okay, we now have moved it to the right, but what's interesting is that the peak is around 2%. So most of them now believe we're going to hit our target. But if anything, by the way, if they disagree to the downside. There's more people reporting below 2 than above 2. But what's happened in the most recent survey is that picture remains broadly the same, but now you see on the right side, the right tail has gone up. There's now a minority who now are fearful that inflation will remain relatively high, where here that's above 2.5%. So not double digit, but above where we want it to be. So this is a different situation. You can read it optimistically by saying it's centered around 2. They believe us that inflation will come back to 2%, but some people have some concerns. The financial markets also trade inflation, and what you see here on the left side is the expected inflation has gone up, but it's gone up to around 2%. So what they expect is also in line with the 2% target. But the risk premium has turned from a discount to a premium. They are now looking for protection against inflation remaining above 2. So again, the market has concerns. They don't think that the most likely outcome remains 2%, but they have some concerns. And we now have a consumer expectation survey. We also ask households across the euro area. And what's interesting here, and this is again 3 years ahead, so when everything settles down, for a long time, the median European believed that inflation will return to 2%. Now the median European and the mean has revised up by about 1 percentage point. Now we don't expect households to be professional forecasters, so it's not so much whether they are fully accurate in their expectation, but the fact that they're upwardly revising their beliefs is some concern. The right side shows you where that's coming from. Again, there's still plenty of people who believe inflation will be 0 or whatever, but there is an increase in those who are fearful that inflation will be quite high, which again is a concern. Now, one of the ways all of that could take a concrete form is in wage negotiations. So if workers believe that not only is inflation high today, it's going to remain high, they're going to be looking for higher wage settlements. And what we see here, look at the green lines, those are the most recent settlements. And the green lines are saying the settlements that have been signed this year, so when inflation has already been high, are having nominal increases around 3% this year and 2.5% next year. So that's more than normal. So there is more wage adjustment than normal, but the fact that they're asking for more this year and less next year is in line with the belief that inflation is going to fall. But of course, there's many wage negotiations still to be settled in the autumn, and so this remains a very big focus for us, is will those wage settlements be in line with the inflation falling back towards 2%, or will there be a destabilization? So let me come to monetary policy. So with that kind of revision in the inflation environment, where not only is near-term inflation high, but the old problem of inflation being too low in the medium term has now been replaced by a diagnosis that we think inflation will be around our targeted medium term, does call for normalization. One type of normalization has been to vastly reduce QE. So this is the monthly purchases under our different programs. We've already stopped under the PEP. We're close to stopping under the APP. We expect to be close to stopping. So that adjustment has already happened. The yield curve, a lot of monetary policy works through the yield curve. And you see here the red line the green line was pre-pandemic. All the effort we did in 2020 was more or less to stabilize the yield curve. If anything, we pushed down a little bit. So the red line is December 2020, which was the bottom of the yield curve. And in 21, we tolerated, as the economy started to improve, a moderate increase in the yield curve in the orange line. But look at what's happened this year. Compared to all of that, the fact that the inflation environment is changing, the fact that they understand we are on a normalization path has meant already a lot of the adjustment has already happened. The yield curve has moved quite a bit, as you can see. And TLTROs, let's not forget about our targeted lending. This is the minimum pricing under TLTROs, which we brought to this very low level of -1 percentage point. But that's coming to an end in June. And what I show here is different possible interest rates under the TLTROs for the coming years. They're all chained to the DA4, so it depends what your view of the DA4, which I take from surveys. But you can see the TLTRO funding is also normalizing in terms of pricing. So let me stop there. Under this situation, it's clear that the policy package, which was introduced when inflation was too low, is no longer needed. It's appropriate to normalize. As you heard from President Lagarde on Monday, the initial steps in terms of policy rates, there's a clear roadmap there. Let me emphasize from a kind of optimal policy point of view, we think this is robust. Under quite a range of scenarios, it's appropriate to make those initial steps. So that's a very important value in policy making, that it's basically the correct policy under a range of scenarios for the economy. So moving in line with the roadmap laid out by President Lagarde is robust policy. Now, after that, what we do think is what happens next is state contingent. The uncertainty about the war, but in the other direction, the uncertainty about how quickly inflation will come down calls for optionality, flexibility, and gradualism in our policy after that point. And this is basically a reflection of our overall commitment. I won't read it out, it's how we conclude the monetary policy statement. But basically, all of our instruments within our mandate, incorporating flexibility if warranted, we will use all of that to make sure that inflation stabilises at 2% over the medium term. So I apologise for being maybe too long, but let me stop there. Okay.
Thanks so much. Sorry, I moved you around. Wonderful. And you sit over there. Nice. Thank you very much. And you sit behind it. Perfect.
That's okay. Where did I leave it? It's there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Buenos dias. So, of course, we've had the keynote from Philip Lane, the Chief Economist of the European Central Bank, but we also now have a panel discussion, and we're joined by three very notable speakers. Of course, what we all share here is that at one point you have been either awarded or awarded this award. Well, Philip Lane, perhaps already, an expert on this. And we're now joined, of course, by Oddmar Ising, who's the president for Center for Financial Studies. For many, he is one of the original minds behind the euro. And remotely, we're joined by Professor Woodhart, who is right here. He's Professor Emeritus at the LSE. And over there, we have Professor Benmo, who's also at the LSE and also received this award. And I know all of you have a presentation to make. But before we do that, Mr. Lane, I have to ask you what is the question in everyone's minds here. And of course, it's inflation. And you said it right there. Some of the expectations in markets and investors have been shifting. And I wonder, the question is, can they trust that the ECB will fulfill this mandate? And I guess you're going to say yes. What's behind that yes?
So this is a very important issue, which is basically when the problem is inflation being too high, we know what to do. Essentially, we can move the interest rates. We have and our overall monetary instruments to basically make sure that inflation comes down. So there is no technical barrier, and we just had a strategy review. Unanimity in the Governing Council that delivering 2% over the medium term, there should be no uncertainty, I think, about this. And remember, the ECB, we were very clear primary mandate. So I don't think there should be any concerns about this. So this is very different to recent years when inflation was too low. Because when inflation is too low and there's a lower bound on interest rates, there was a genuine debate about how quickly could we bring inflation to 2%? How long would it take? So there is a kind of a feasibility issue of delivering 2% from below, but delivering 2% from above is something that's happened many times. Central banks know how to do it, but of course we have a medium-term orientation. So the goal is to do it in a way that absolutely delivers in the medium term, but basically in an efficient way.
And can I just ask you, and then I go back to script, I promise, but just to make it very clear, because over the past few days, we've seen there's almost this theory in markets that the longer perhaps that the ECB waits, the more aggressive this initial first step is going to be. I know you're not going to give me an exact BPS what that means, but is that thinking right?
It's an important principle that, yes, if you ignore the problem and if you wait too long, of course you would have to do more later on. But we have not ignored the problem. We already, in December last year, we announced and not everyone in the outside world was happy with us, we announced we can end purchasing under the PEP. You can see from my graph, in fact, from actually summer 2020 onwards, we had brought down purchasing under our QE. And with the forward guidance, The forward guidance was telling the markets when inflation pressure is basically stabilizing around 2, we will lift off. They anticipate that. So look at the scale. A lot of monetary action has already happened through the yield curve. So we have not been waiting. We could have taken a different route of trying to resist that big increase in the yield curve. A year ago, we had concerns about the yield curve because the recovery was still only starting. So I think very much we all year long, I think in January I started talking about normalization. And so all year long we've been talking about normalization and sequential, bringing the QE to an end, the TLTRO repricing that's there, and then the last step is to move the policy rate. And President Lagarde laid it out. I don't need to repeat that because I think it's a very natural, very strong, and let me emphasize from my point of view, robust policy path here, which is to move the policy rate in our meetings in the third quarter. And after that, the exact speed after that, let's see where we are with the economy. Because we are heavily emphasizing, and maybe one difference in my time period when Otmar was there, is that the amount of data we have now, to say we are data dependent, we have a lot of data we can look at to try and see where we are. And very much, I think, from that point onwards, making that judgment with the data would be very important.
Well, Mr. Lane, thanks so much for putting you, I put you on the spot from the get-go, so thanks for taking those 2 questions. And now it's time for the presentations, and I know that Professor Whithart, he has a presentation to make, which of course you can follow here on my right. Professor?
Thank you very much. I can't resist responding to Philip's answer to that last question, because it takes me back to my experience in the early 1970s, when the oil prices went up. Then central bankers were saying it is extraordinarily difficult to cut back high inflation, particularly by monetary policy, because that will lead to unacceptably high unemployment. On the other hand, we as central banks can always deal with excessively low inflation because all we have to do is increase the rate of growth of the money stock. So, 40 odd years ago, the idea about what was doable and what wasn't doable have simply reversed. And I'm inclined to think that there was as much truth in what we thought in the 1970s then as there is now. But anyhow, let me start by saying that I share very much with Philip my thanks to the governor, to the Fundación, and to the Observatory. But I would like also to add my thanks to Jose Luis Pedro, who was very much responsible for running and organizing the last Bernàcer Prize, and also for starting much with the organization of this excellent meeting here. And I would also like to start by expressing my deep sympathy for Philip, because I think he's enormously in the hot seat, and a very hot seat it is. And I wish him every possible luck, because he's going to need it. It's a very, very difficult situation for the ECB. It's harder for many ways for the ECB than it is for the Fed, because it's much more, as Philip rightly said, a supply shock for Europe, rather than for the US, which is self-sufficient or even exports energy and food. And it is a very severe supply shock in which what you find is that real incomes, and possibly if things get worse, real output goes down at the same time as inflation goes up. And dealing with a supply shock is a great deal more difficult than dealing with a demand shock. And the Ukraine war has undoubtedly led to the most severe supply shock, in many ways more severe as a supply shock than COVID ever was, because that was a mixture of demand and supply. On the other hand, the conditions are still slightly more hopeful in the euro area than I think they are in the US and the UK, because in the latter two countries, I think a wage price spiral is quite clearly already underway. And as Philip indicated, the evidence is that that's not yet necessarily the case in the EU. That said, I think that it is undeniable that virtually all the central banks, including the ECB, are an awful long way behind the curve. Let me put it another way. Over the last, I think it's about 18 months now or so, inflation in the euro area has risen from about 1.5 to about 7.5, an increase of 6%. During that time, the official interest rate has remained negative. Can you really believe a situation in which official nominal interest rates are negative, and yet inflation is at 7.5 and showing no immediate signs of going down? And indeed, QE, although slowed up and we're told it's going to get reversed, has still been continuing. So what we have got is massively expansionary monetary policy over these last 18 months, because if inflation goes up and nominal interest rates do not anything like as much, that effectively is a decline in real interest rates. And real interest rates in the EU are now at a negative level of negative 8%. And it's extraordinary that this should have been allowed. How has it been allowed? Well, Bernàcer has argued that what has happened is that central banks have been, to a large extent, prisoners of their forward guidance, rather than data dependent. And because they have guided people to believe that interest rates would remain very low and everything was going to be all right, that very little has actually happened, while inflation has been getting sharply ahead. Now you can say, okay, but surely this inflation is going to be temporary. The word transitory, I'm glad to say, has now disappeared, but it is clear that the massive inflation of energy cannot persist. And that the inflation rate, which in the EU is primarily energy related, is bound to slow down at least somewhat. And then you think that if expectations are so-called well anchored, we'll all tend to be all right without having to do too much more. I think there are very considerable dangers in that. Again, I'm reminded only too clearly of my experience in the 1970s, when, at any rate in the UK, most economists said that the massive increase in oil prices, a quadrupling, was temporary, and that we should look through this and not raise interest rates enormously in order to protect output and employment. And of course, what happened was that we soon got a wage price spiral developing. One of my concerns is that people think that wages are and demands are due only to what is expected in future. Whereas if you've got inflation at 7.5 and maybe rising, that already has given a massive hit to your real standards of living. And if you are in a position where you can have the power to do so, you're going to react to what has happened, the fact that your income standards have been cut. And again, the expectations of firms and households, as is shown by an increasing number of studies, relate primarily to what actually has been happening, rather more than to what central banks are inclined to say that they hope will happen in future. So when you look through what is a temporary surge in inflation caused by the Ukraine war, energy and food and stuff, Well, it depends on a number of factors. One factor is the scale. If your incomes are cut so sharply and you can, in a position through shortages of labor to bargain to return them back to where they were, you will do so, even if you think that the inflation may be somewhat temporary. It also depends on the duration. If the spike is clearly very short term, then you may be much more prepared to look through it. But remember, quite a lot of these forces leading to higher inflation are going to be longer lasting than many people currently realize. Take food, for example. This year's harvest, particularly in Ukraine, is going to be a disaster. Fertilizer prices are sky high, and there is going to be a massive food shortage. The IMF is worrying about famine in the less developed world. And that is not going to be rectified before the harvest, not of this year, because this year is gone, of 2023 comes in. So you're going to have very high, probably rising for some quite lengthy time, food prices until the second half of 2023. Beyond that, the rise in energy prices clearly won't go on at this kind of anything like. But remember the work that Isabel Schnabel and others have done, which show that climate change is bound to lead, and indeed should lead, to fossil fuel prices being very high over an extended period. So that the idea that prices are going to come sort of back down and everything is going to be right because prices start coming down, we're going to have expectations, favorable expectations, I think is wildly optimistic. Now let me end with two comments. One, I'm very glad that Philip never mentioned the word neutral. There's been a lot of chat in the US about what is the neutral rate to which interest rates have to go before they cease being accommodating and begin to be restrictive. Now, the concept of neutral, I think, makes a lot of sense when you are and are expected to remain at the inflation target rate of inflation. But when inflation has been rising so much and is so far ahead of the levels that you want, the concept of neutral, I think, makes very little sense at all. What you need is to raise rates until they start bearing down quite significantly on the inflation process. And where that point is at the moment, I think virtually nobody has any very clear idea. And the idea that it is perhaps limited to somewhere around 2.5% to 3.5% is, again, I think, wildly optimistic. Let me end very quickly with one minor comment about the Bernàcer Prize, which is, it troubles me that so many of those who have won that prize are now currently working in the US. We need to have our best economists in Europe, helping Europe with the policy difficulties which we have. And I do hope that a larger proportion of the Bernàcer Prize winners will in future either be or return to Europe, where we need your work very much indeed. So I shall end there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor, and also that comment at the end. You know, it's a very active debate, this battle for talent on the two sides of the Atlantic. And now we go. You can speak for them, yeah. And
from here,
if you prefer.
Or if you prefer standing, whatever you prefer.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation and joining the governor Congratulations on such a number of excellent young economists which have over time proven that they were rightly awarded with this prize. And I'm proud that I was the chairman of the first committee, and with choosing Philip Lane, I think we set a standard. So Philip, also thank you for your kind words on my work, also to Pablo. I remember our offices were close at the ECB, and we had many discussions which were also helpful for me. Let me start with a kind of personal remark, but I make this because it explains my approach to the present situation. When I became out of the sudden a central banker in 1999, leaving academia, I asked myself, what is the main challenge moving from academia to policy making? And the first, of course, message was to myself, in the future, you are not just writing papers who probably nobody reads or ignores, it doesn't matter, but now taking decisions will have an impact on the life of so many people. So this is a kind of personal responsibility which I think has accompanied all my life as a central banker. And the second point is a more technical one. Just at the time when I joined the Bundesbank, the Swiss National Bank was confronted with a structural shift which it didn't realize. It was a change in the payment system and in reserve holdings of banks. And it had an impact on its monetary target, which was a narrow target, base money, and they ignored this. They did not realize. So they kept to their initial monetary target and conducted a much too loose monetary policy, just for technical mistake, not recognizing that a structural shift had happened. As it just happened at that time, it was a warning for me, but more important and more fundamental was the work of Bob Lucas on regime shifts, which had a strong impact on my thinking and went in the same direction, be aware that structures might change and it might be difficult to discover that timely. So when I joined the Bundesbank in October 1990, German unification was underway. And this was, of course, a big structural shift to the German economy. It was a regime shift. And 8 years later, unexpectedly being at the ECB, this was probably experiencing the most dramatic regime shift in monetary history. And I discussed that with my staff and external experts in all aspects, what this might imply, because this was unknown, it was uncharted territory. And this was one of the reasons, the main reason, why I, against all expectations in Germany, and not only in Germany, I warned strongly against adopting a monetary target because of this uncertainty, because of this regime shift. So this is a starting point because in my analysis, central banks are confronted again with a regime shift on a global level. During the Great Moderation, a long period of low and stable inflation, continuous growth and moderate unemployment, the risk of higher inflation was off the radar, even in some circles of central banks. Understandably, if for 30 years inflation disappears, people are directing their mind probably in the wrong direction, that this period might last. And this inflation started to rise well above the 2% target in 2021, quite a number of central banks have been in the so-called transitory camp, expecting inflation to return to prior low levels via self-correction, so to speak, mainly due to energy prices ceasing to rise any further and then falling again. As a consequence, central banks saw no need for action to counter the risk of higher inflation at an early stage. Until the end of last year, the ECB even went so far as to communicate that sooner rather than later it would be confronted once again with a situation of too low inflation by projecting inflation rates to fall below its target of 2%. Even before the Russian attack on Ukraine, the ECB repeatedly had to revise its inflation assessment upwards. Philip has shown that in his charts. We know any forecast of inflation is based on assumptions about various exogenous variables, with oil and other energy prices playing a major role. This is the reason why the ECB still uses the term projections, signaling that the staff bases its work on assumptions. But I think the problem of the ECB's severe underestimation of inflation since mid-2021 has a deeper source. It has largely ignored that traditional models were unable to take the substantial structural changes into account. I'm not saying that the models are not useful anymore, quite the opposite. But you need, to my assessment, a broader approach. The economic downturn caused by the pandemic is very different from a cyclical recession. Philip Lane showed a graph on the development of the savings ratio. In Germany, already being at a high level, it doubled. In other countries, it tripled. But this was pent-up demand, which means as soon, to take just one example, Germans are spending vacations, many go to Spain and other countries with more sun and better weather. And as soon as airlines opened their flights over the week before Easter, all flights were booked out in 1 hour. So this was, so to say, a recovery of tourism, which is very different from a cyclical recovery, very different. I think also on wage developments, the situation is different, because in a normal cyclical upturn, we see a initially moderate, but broad-based increase in wages. In the context of the pandemic, this is a sectoral development. Just to mention the 50,000 truck drivers which are missing in UK. So you have strong wage increases in some sectors, and it will certainly take much more time, and this develops into a broad-based wage development. So I think this is a situation very different from cycles in the past. The pandemic, as a combination of supply and demand shock, entails a persistent negative shock on the output potential and is a major source of structural problems which had to be addressed by targeted and temporary measures of fiscal policy, which was done, especially the Fed, but probably to some extent also the ECB have underestimated the inflationary impact of expansionary fiscal policies. A major deep structural change is taking place on the global level. In an important book written by Charles Goodhart and Bradan, they have analyzed the main factors which will bring a change in the international environment from a disinflationary impact to a world where inflationary influences will dominate. Demographics is a major factor, aging, but also the rise of protectionism. The war still will strengthen the intention in all countries to reduce dependency on foreign sources of energy as well as other essential products. What are the consequences of these and other developments for the monetary policy of the central banks? It is hard to understand why the ECB for so long has remained in the crisis mode it adopted after the financial crisis in 2007-8. Zero or even negative interest rates and still net purchases of bonds, quantitative easing, to my judgment, were no longer appropriate in a period when the economy was improving and unemployment was at its lowest level since the start of the euro, which implied also the danger of an inflationary development. Now, with inflation rates not seen during the existence of the euro, the ECB has just started to consider a very late and, according to the announcement, still timid exit from the monetary policy crisis mode. It is true that monetary policy cannot control energy prices and should look through temporary price shocks. Its role is to prevent inflation expectations from losing their anchor and wages, profits starting an upward trend. The pandemic, war-induced military spending, and other geopolitical crises, expenditures due to aging populations, and not least climate policy, will contribute to higher public spending. This implies a strong risk that debts, having already reached historically high levels, will increase further, with consequences for the sustainability and credibility of public finances in a number of countries. Efforts to weaken fiscal rules could further undermine fiscal discipline and contribute to inflationary pressure. The war, as a negative supply shock, indicates the risk that the euro area is heading towards in the direction of a stagflationary environment. It's too early to tell, but the risk exists. Starting to get out of the crisis mode under such circumstances is a big challenge for central bankers. But as the experience of stagflation in the 1970s demonstrates, letting inflation rise uncontrolled is no appropriate option for a central bank with a mandate priority for price stability. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much. I'm sure maybe by Lucius there's a few comments you may want to make after. And we are now, last but not least, Professor Moll, who's also joining us remotely. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Great. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Receiving the Bernàcer Prize from Governor Hernández de Cos back in 2018 was definitely one of the professional highlights of my career. So it's sort of great to be back here. There also seem to be many familiar faces in the audience. So I think Guillermo de la Dehesa is going to speak this afternoon. He was there. And of course, Immaculada, who's been invaluable to this effort and been doing fantastic work. So I have some slides to share. So let me try to see if this works. Okay, there you go. And I'm going to talk here about energy sanctions against Russia. What options does the European Union have and how costly are they? And I should say this is sort of a combination of two papers. So we wrote very early on after the start of the war, sort of within 2 weeks, we wrote a quick paper about here. It's called What If? The Economic Effects for Germany of a Stop of Energy Imports from Russia. And we assembled a team of a bunch of mostly German economists. And I kind of wanted to emphasize here, this also has a Bernàcer Prize connection. In particular, in this work, we're building very heavily on a very nice theoretical work by David Bakai, together with the late Emmanuel Farhi, who was a former Bernàcer Prize winner, and of course, one of the sort of brilliant young European economists of the recent decades. who we all miss very much. So, I just wanted to mention that. And then there's another paper we're building on where we assembled, or I was part of a group here that was called the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions, that was organized by the former governor of the United States to Russia, Mike McFaul, who's at the Freeman Spalley Institute at Stanford, and we wrote here a roadmap paper on what are the sanctions options. So I'll build on this as well. Okay, so you're obviously all aware of the terrible war happening in Ukraine, and what's important, and I think also everyone is aware of, is that Russia's economy and its budget are underpinned by revenues from the sale of oil and gas, primarily to the European Union. Just to put this in perspective, since the start of the war, the EU has paid the Kremlin around $800 million a day to import Russian oil and gas. And I think has been quite convincingly argued that these payments finance Putin's war in Ukraine, either directly or indirectly. I don't have time to go into this, but I draw your attention to the work of Sergei Guriev, former chief economist of the EBRD, and who also had advisory roles in the Kremlin, and Oleg Itskoky, who just won the Clark Medal to the best American economist or economist working in the United States under 40. So, as a result, I think, and lots of other people think, right, that there's sort of the need for immediate European action to, first of all, reduce Russia's oil and gas revenues rapidly, and then also, of course, in the longer term, eliminate the dependence of the European economy on these energy sources. And, I think two is definitely happening in lots of countries. So I'm from Germany. This is definitely happening in Germany. But what's not so much happening is this sort of rapid reduction in oil and gas revenues. So as we all are aware, the European Commission on May 4th, so President von der Leyen announced plans for a complete import ban on all Russian oil in the next 3 to 6 months, which I think is a very good step in the right direction. And this seems to be in the process of getting somewhere. However, there's some problems with this, in particular with regards to the rapidity. So first of all, there seems to be some political resistance from some member countries, in particular Hungary comes to mind. Then most importantly, I would say 3 to 6 months is just not very rapid. It's just quite a long time, essentially. And in particular, it gives Russia a fair amount of time to reroute its oil exports. Third, there's also another effect, which is the fact that this embargo is announced to come in 6 months in the future, could actually have a counterproductive effect, which is that in the short run, it increases demand for Russian oil and hence its price. And, I think part of the reason why oil prices have increased so much may be due to this. So the idea, right, is that everyone knows that in 6 months, there is no more Russian oil anymore. So let's better, buy more now, and that's going to drive up the price. Okay. So as a result of these problems, I think if we want to actually have an effect on the war, at least in the medium term, I think it's important to complement or substitute this oil embargo with other policy options. I refer you here to this energy sanctions roadmap paper. I don't have time to go into this in detail. If you Google International Sanctions Working Group, you'll come across this document. Here are a bunch of policy ideas that weren't just floated by us, but that we summarized in this document that I think could go somewhere, and in particular could be implemented more rapidly. So first of all, there could be a tax on the sellers of Russian energy into Europe, both for oil and gas. There's this escrow idea. I think it could be useful to rather than each member country trying to negotiate with Gazprom, say in particular, separately, to have a European gas negotiator. In particular, this rubles issue comes to mind there. And then the fourth one, I think, is a very good idea, which seems to have gained some traction recently, which is in combination with the announced oil embargo to counteract this perverse price effect. One could complement this announced oil embargo with a price cap. So Simon Johnson and Lucas Rachel wrote a nice piece about this, And there seem to be some European member countries that want to do something there. My personal opinion, but this is sort of me just speaking as a citizen rather than an economist, is really doing pretty much anything at this point is better than doing nothing. We're spending a lot of time at this point, 3 months, I guess, discussing pros and cons of various options, and things are just moving very slow. So I think this needs to change. Okay. So then obviously, so these are the policy options. An important question would be sort of what are the costs of these various policy options on the European economy? And obviously you want to avoid using energy sanctions that would be extremely costly to the European economy. So early on during the war, we tried to sort of get a handle on this. We wrote this what if paper here, where the goal was to assess the economic consequences for Germany, just because most of us were German and a lot of the debate centered on Germany, of a cutoff from Russian energy imports. Again, there's sort of two reasons why one may want to do that. So first of all, what's the cost of an embargo? But on the flip side of that, of course, it could always happen that Putin could decide to switch off the gas taps, in particular, as he has done for a bunch of countries at this point. So Bulgaria and Poland and Finland in particular. Okay. So what the goal here was always to get a handle on what's the economic cost to Germany of sort of a worst case scenario of a cold turkey complete import stop of all energy imports from Russia. We thought this was a useful exercise, in particular because it sort of bounds other scenarios, in particular other policy options, say a tariff. So this sort of cold turkey complete import stop, I think it's become very clear at this point, is at least in Germany, but also at the EU level, a political non-starter, in particular with respect to gas. I'll come back to this, but we think this is still a useful exercise just to sort of bound things. And then, of course, we also have to be aware if we start, say, taxing Russian oil and gas, or we start putting a price cap on oil, Russia may retaliate with a complete import stop. And so it's, again, useful to know what the total cost would be. So again, the sense here was always to get a sense of the goal was to get a sense of the rough magnitude of the economic losses, in particular relative to a do-nothing baseline. So essentially take Philip Lane's forecast for the euro area economy, and then everything I tell you, you got to sort of deduct from that. So if you think that GDP is growing by 2% per year, you got to deduct our numbers from that, and same for inflation. So here's some options that people have mentioned. So what could be the cost? So you could think maybe an import stop could just lead to a small GDP decline, say 0.5 percentage point or 1 percentage point. So relative to baseline, then this may not even be a recession. You could think maybe it's going to be like COVID. So in Germany, COVID led to 4.5% decline in GDP. So which is obviously sizable, but not a major catastrophe. Third, it could be like the euro area crisis in some country. And fourth, and here I'm citing statements by German politicians on TV, a oil and gas import stop could lead to mass unemployment and poverty. This was Economics Minister Habeck early on, or millions of lost jobs. That was Chancellor Scholz, which to me, these words at least sound something like a Great Depression. So here again, the sort of options, that you could imagine. Here's our message, so the takeaway. So when we crunched the numbers, we thought that for Germany, an import stop would be costly, but it would lead to sort of a GDP decline between 0.5 percentage point and worst case scenario, 3 percentage points. So the takeaway here is essentially an import stop would be sort of more like in these upper two scenarios here, something like a little less severe than a COVID recession, definitely not a Great Depression type scenario. So that's really the main takeaway here. Okay. Bunch of more comments just to place the paper in perspective. It's really a paper about gas, not oil. Why? Because that's the elephant in the room in Germany. I'll come back to this. I'll talk about oil a bit at the end. There's also a very interesting related historical episode, which is that Chile was cut off from Argentinian gas in 2007. Andres Velasco, who used to be the finance minister, and Marcelo Tacon, who used to be the energy minister, wrote a very nice piece about this. The estimates there are for a GDP loss of 0.5 percentage point to 1 percentage point, so at the lower end of our estimates. It's also not really a paper about inflation, though I'll talk about this at the end. Okay, so let me show you some numbers briefly, why people are concerned about energy imports from Russia, in particular in the German context. In other European Union member countries, these numbers look different. In most countries, they look smaller, so other countries are usually less reliant on Russian energy imports, but there are some exceptions, in particular, sort of further east. Okay, but here for Germany, what this table here shows is essentially total energy consumption in Germany, and then it splits it according to different energy sources. And then in particular, it shows what fraction of the energy consumption comes from Russia. And then the key takeaway is that for oil, gas, and coal, these are large numbers. So in particular, if you look at gas here, before the war, 55% of all German gas consumption came from Russia. So, that's why people are worried. These are, very large numbers. So I already said this, we sort of focus on gas rather than oil and coal. Why is that? The reason is that these are very different in terms of the markets and how these are traded. So oil and coal have a global market, and in particular, you can put oil and coal on a ship and ship them relatively easily. Whereas for gas, things are very different. Gas is primarily delivered through pipelines. In particular, in Germany, does not have any, so far at least, capacities for liquefied natural gas, so no LNG terminals. They're just starting to build them now, but before the war, they didn't have anything. And so for gas, it's just much harder to substitute the gas consumption. So as a result, we sort of focused here on gas, but I'll come back to oil and coal later. I'll go fast here. So we did some calculations, essentially, how much of this 55% gas, which in the case of a complete import stop would fall away, can you substitute in some way or another? And our energy economists on the project crunched the numbers, and they essentially said you can either import or substitute in some other way 25% of that 55%. So the gas shock where you cannot replace the gas is 30%. In retrospect, now it's sort of 3 months later, almost, or two and a half months later. I think if anything, our assumptions here were conservative. So the German government put out some reports here in May, how much they've already reduced Russian energy consumption. And even within sort of just 2 months or 2.5 months, they've reduced these numbers a lot that I showed you on the previous slide. In particular, again, like, importing gas from other countries and so on. So again, sort of right in line with our assumptions, arguably a bit faster. And I should have said this, the relevant time horizon here, we think for gas is really until next winter. Why? Because gas demand is very seasonal. So in the heating season, that's really when gas demand is high. So that's why you have this sort of natural time window to get alternative gas supplies. And this hasn't even yet used substitution of gas and electricity generation. I think just yesterday, the economics ministry floated a new law in Germany that would basically force electricity generators to burn something else than gas. So in particular, say lignite. Okay, I'll speed up a bit here. So, just some facts about the German economy. I just want to highlight the numbers in red here. So the first thing is, if you just look at gas as a share of GDP, so just total gas consumption as a share of GDP, it's something like 1% of GDP. So it's a small number, okay? But of course, that doesn't mean that the shock, the effect of the shock will be small. Why? Because gas is sort of this bottleneck in production that sort of feeds through the supply chains and the production networks. So there could be a lot of amplification. At the same time, there's something else that I think should make one sort of relatively optimistic about the effects, which is, the primary worry is what's going to happen to industrial production. I just put here sort of how much gas is used in industrial production, and then also just how much economic activity is there in industry. And if you look at that, in Germany, something like 20 or 25% of economic activity is in industry. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is because I think a lot of people have the prior that these numbers are a lot higher. Okay, people think that something like 50% of the German economy is industry. Okay, it's just not true. This would have been true in the 1970s and so on, and that when you draw the effect, the analogy to the oil price shock, it's important to keep in mind that the economy in lots of countries has just changed a lot. In particular, industry has gotten much less important. Okay. Okay. So here's what we tried to do, and this is again where we build in particular on this nice work by Emmanuel Fari. So we basically, starting from the facts, tried to map this energy shock, these 30% gas, into GDP losses using some macro models. And again, sort of gas is 1% of GDP and it decreases by 30%. Just to sort of give you a sense of magnitudes of what could happen, I want to show you two extreme calculations that I'm going to argue are sort of nonsensical or inconsistent with what we know about the data. So very naively, you could say, okay, gas is 1% of GDP, gas falls by 30%, so let's just multiply the two up. So 1% times 30% is 0.3%, so that's the GDP loss. I want to say that's wrong and too low. Why? Because that sort of forgets about all the bottleneckness of gas and all the amplification through production networks and so on. On the other extreme, you could think there's no substitutability of gas whatsoever. And then even though gas is tiny in production, if gas falls by GDP by 30%, then GDP would fall by 30%. I want to say that's also nonsensical and way too extreme, okay? And we're going to be somewhere in between. And our results essentially are going to say there's going to be large amplification relative to this naive 0.3% calculation, but by a factor of 10, so going up to 3%, not by a factor of 100. Okay. Let me skip this. This is more for the economists. There's an easy way to think about this here. Okay. A little word on sort of what modern economies look like and why gas is a worry, and in Germany there's always talk about sort of cascading effects through production networks, and what that means and how that would work here. Okay, and this is again where we build on this nice work by Emmanuel Fari and David Bakai. So modern economies have these complex production networks, kind of look something like this here. So what's this graph? So the red dots, so the nodes here are sectors of the economy, and then if there's an arrow, that means that sector uses another sector as an input. So the story that people always tell, right, is gas is imported here, then say this industry here is, say, glass production, then say this industry here is medical ampules, and then say this industry here is pharmaceutical products, and then say this is hospitals, okay? And then the story would be, or the worrisome scenario would be gas declines, or there's no more gas, then glass producers cannot produce glass anymore, then you cannot produce medical ampules anymore, then you cannot produce medicine anymore, then you cannot give medicine to people in hospitals anymore, and then in the extreme scenario, people in hospital are going to die, okay? And so if you think that literally there's no substitution anywhere, that's sort of the bad outcome that would happen. We're going to basically argue that, I mean, that's too extreme. That's just too pessimistic. There is substitution possibilities along this production chain. So the longer the production chain, essentially, the more substitution possibilities there are. In particular, maybe we can, buy the glass ampules from somewhere else, or we can buy the medicine from somewhere else, or you can package the medicine in some other way, and so on.
And Professor, just very briefly, because there's a lot of questions that are coming from the audience, so I want to make sure everyone gets the time. If we had to summarize this presentation, you mentioned a lot of things. I realize there's gas and there's oil, and the two work differently. But you mentioned escrow, you mentioned a cap, you mentioned almost what would look like a buyer's cartel. At this point, two very brief questions to summarize. Could we actually, or can the European economy withstand the impact of moving away from Russian oil, gas? I realize they're differently, but doing it quicker. You say 3 to 6 months is a lot. And then secondly, given the political issues that we have with gas, the Germans, oil, and the Hungarians, what is the best doable option for you?
So regarding the first question, so yeah, the whether the European Union could weather this. So again, our point here, and I mean, let me maybe just sort of show you 2 more slides and then conclude, okay? So the first thing, so this is the kind of numbers that come out of our models, essentially, right? And I already anticipated this a bit. So, you know, gross national expenditure losses or GDP losses of between sort of 1% and 3%, okay? So now, could a country like Germany weather this? Our argument is yes, and you know, these are sizable numbers. Of course, like 3% GDP loss is large and would come together with lost jobs and so on. But then the point is, sort of, Germany is a rich country that has a debt to GDP ratio of something like, you know, 70%, and so we could compensate the losers here essentially in the same way, basically, we've done during the COVID recession. Okay, so again, the takeaway here is the numbers are smaller than during COVID. During COVID, this was also very asymmetric, primarily supply shock, where we managed to compensate the losers from the recession, so we could do this. Relative to the second question, then, and you know, just briefly, there's other estimates as well that kind of have this. So let me maybe actually go to my conclusion slide. So okay, let me maybe just do the conclusion slide and then answer the second question. Okay, again, so the oil embargo plans, I think, are just a little slow, and there's other policy options. So this is going to then get back to your second question. And then bounding the cost, I've already talked about this, okay? So again, we think the cost would be somewhat smaller than COVID, worst case 3% GDP on impact. And we, you know, again, that was a recession in which we were able to provide insurance and compensate the losers. Regarding the first question, so what's the best other options? I mean, I personally like the idea of keeping the announced oil embargo. I realize that gas is more difficult, and I guess it looks like there's no political willingness to pay these 3% costs, which I mean, I can understand. I mean, it's a political decision. I would personally make a different decision, but it's a political decision. So I think a good outcome would be keep the oil embargo and have tariffs or taxes on gas, and then do a price cap on oil to counteract this perverse price effect of the oil embargo being announced. Okay, and let me stop there.
Well, thank you so much. And of course, all of this is going to be very important when European leaders meet Monday, Tuesday, potentially, to talk about all of this. And now we have questions for each of you. I'm going to keep it very briefly. The first one, of course, is for Mr. Lane. It's coming from Ricardo Reis, of course, a professor at the LSE too. And he says, the ECB has announced a strategy review a little over 9 months ago. It was focused on responding to the challenges of a low neutral rates, downward limits to policy interest rates, and climate change, globalization, digitalization. What's the main challenge today being instead high inflation? How would you find that the new strategy has been fit for the challenge? And with the power of foresight, what could you have done differently? So I guess he's saying, does it still apply, and is it still relevant?
So let me emphasize, is the review looked at a lot of issues. I mean, let me differentiate between some novel issues versus the classic issues. And by and large, in the classic issues, we reconfirmed a lot of what was already in place going back to the start of the euro. And essentially, how to tackle high inflation is, unfortunately, one of the classic issues that central banks have had to deal with. So I would say it was part of the review, but of course, in terms of the coverage and so on, just focus on what's novel as opposed to what we've have learned over many decades. And I can, I suppose, reassure Charles, we very much look at the 1970s, the 1960s, as much as possible, all of these historical episodes. But let me, I suppose, fundamentally say we are very much reconfirming the medium-term orientation of monetary policy. The medium term does not mean the indefinite long term. There has to be pressure to get back to 2%. It's not a kind of escape clause to say totally ignore what's going on right now. I would say it's going to be helpful. Some of what Otmar raised, and which is in Charles's book, these issues about structural change are very important. And I suppose there's two levels to that. One is, again, retrospectively, saying that period in the years before the review was atypical, and maybe that's the value of Charles's book in particular, saying this is not forever. And I was also, by the way, confident this idea that, you know, I would always tell people low rates are not here forever. It's a response to today's challenge, and the way we will return to normal is by persisting with these policies until it's stable. Otmar, I know this phrasing was very much there in 2014, 2015 when QE was introduced. It was a crisis mechanism. Well, in 2018, the Governing Council decided to turn it off. So QE was ended at the end of 2018, and then it turned out it was premature, that there were weakening of the global economy, and the decision was made that there was nothing we could see that would bring inflation back to 2% unless QE was restarted in September 19, which is also shows also a further cut in the deposit rate. So it goes back to one of the big strategic issues where these are all policies not only for crises, but whenever inflation is too low. What we have now is inflation we think will settle at the target, so they are no longer appropriate. Maybe the same outcome, but maybe the threshold we had for ending QE, ending negative rates and so on was a little bit different. And of course, there can be a lot of room for judgment calls. The big issue is, in the end, the language is maybe a bit different, but maybe it has the same result. It is a lot in the end boils down to the policy setting. In order to forestall some of these risks, and there is a risk management issue here, we definitely we did not sign up to a world where we said we'll wait and see until inflation has already arrived. We still, in our strategy, very much emphasize if we foresee inflation rising, then we act. So it was not the case we have just an outcome-based approach. So if we foresee, and of course we'll have new projections in a few weeks, then it will be grounds to act. So I would say the ECB is very much still in that camp, is trying to anticipate, not wait. But a very interesting issue for Charles maybe is if people felt real interest rates were -7.5 or -8, whatever number you want to pick, is this showing up in behaviour? Because we should see really low savings rate. We don't see it. We should see an amazing investment boom. We're not seeing it because it's in the context of other factors also being present. Now, I agree with the idea we cannot leave rates where they are because even if the inflation so far has been unexpected, expected inflation, even if it's the analysts think another year of being well above 2 and then going back to around 2. Even there, with that amount of expected inflation, the rates where they've been are too low. So we do need to normalise, absolutely. But let's see, we're emphasising gradualism because we do have to see the feedback loop about how the movement in financing conditions affect the economy. So I would say to Ricardo, going back to the basic question, it is the strategy we do think has been a very important update. It is very important that we had that before this shock happened, because to simultaneously work on the framework at the same time you're trying to diagnose what's going on would be difficult. But I do think, having done a lot of homework for the strategy review, it is making policy making easier when we have a common language, a common analysis.
And not to create tensions, but since you also alluded to Mr. Issing's presentation, at one point in his presentation, if I'm not wrong, you did say you had the impression that the ECB had been at times a little bit slow. Do you think that description is fair?
In real time, I'm comfortable with the fact, and you were saying the ECB forecast. It's the whole world of forecasting. So it's not the case there was anyone else. Now, of course, there's always people emphasising tail risk, upside risk, and I mean, within the Governing Council, within the ECB, absolutely as well. So what is interesting or very important, and at this point it is too early to tell, about the fact, but let me make one point. Let's say the earliest possible time we could have made the call that the world has, is different is maybe around last September. So we did start to upgrade our forecast last September, and if we had moved at that point or started to normalise, earlier, it's very important to say is the inflation rate today would not be much different, because until now there has not been the wage inflation, there's not been a domestic demand surge yet. So this would all be about positioning monetary policy for the coming months. To start a bit earlier may influence that. But the inflation rate today, we should be clear, it's imported, it's coming from the supply shock. I'm not so sure the inflation rate right now would be very far different unless we had gone beyond normalisation to some dramatic shift. So let's see, it's going to be a running debate, and I think we should all be very open-minded about looking back and being self-critical, absolutely. But maybe it's too early to be conclusive on that.
Very respectful, but also insightful answer. Mr. Issing, there's also a question for me, and it's coming from Stilby Neuburg, who was professor at Columbia University, but also was a winner of this prize, the 15th edition of the Bernàcer Prize. And the question is, with inflation running high and quantitative tightening on the horizon, long-term interest rates are poised to go up on sovereign debt across the euro area, with debt to GDP levels much higher than they were before COVID. How much of a worry is it to have higher interest rates for debt sustainability, and how much could it constrain monetary policy?
I think one has to consider that on a global level, debt levels are the highest ever, private and public debt combined. And this moment reminds me of the publication by Reinhard Rogoff, "This Time is Different." So as such, this number should be frightening, because the last notion, "this time is different," has proven to be the wrong approach. So I think this is a situation like many caskets of power standing around and some fire coming from where it might be a big impact on financial markets. So this is a general risk. But this implies also a situation in which high indebted countries are exposed very much to rising interest rates. And this is part of my concern, critique, if you wish, that central banks for a while have contributed, that governments are addicted to low long-term interest rates. So financing public debt is, in Germany it was even a profit for every euro you got into debt, you got a profit because negative long-term interest rates. So this was creating illusions. And for politicians, of course, such a situation is very difficult to explain, that we have to be concerned about debt when you earn money on increasing debt. But for the euro area, it's in general a problem, and especially for high indebted countries. So they are exposed very much to rate increases. And this is a situation, and it's not new, but it can be solved not by the ECB, President Lagarde at the beginning has rightly said it's not the task of the ECB to control spreads on government bonds.
Which she kind of corrected after, to some extent.
Let's say it was corrected, so it was corrected. But we have to differentiate what the increase in spread, what is the reason for that? Is it high indebtedness, which is a fiscal situation, or is the risk of what the ECB calls redenomination? So there are two different issues, but it's very difficult to separate, and I think it's obvious that in the end, governments have to create, to maintain credibility in their fiscal situation. This is something which cannot be solved by the ECB. It has to be done by governments.
By governments, although the ECB has said recently that they don't see potentially grounds for a debt crisis, even in the context of QT, just to make it clear. Then we have a question for Professor Goodhart, who's coming from Stephanie Smith-Grobe, who's professor of Columbia University too, and she says, conventional wisdom has it that when an economy is hit by an adverse supply shock, nominal rates should be raised to increase the real interest rates temporarily to curtail demand. Once the shock is over, nominal rates should be lowered back down. However, in the current circumstances, this would mean that once the shock is over, policy rates should return to minus 50 basis points. Do you think rates will indeed return to minus 50 basis points, so negative territory? And if not, the tightening, would it be more permanent in nature? What do you think are the macroeconomics effects of such a permanent tightening, and are there similar, or would they be similar to transitory ones? What are the differences between the two?
Thank you very much. Let me quickly respond to Philip. There has been a general increase in housing prices, a much more coordinated and much faster increase in housing prices than would have been the case if real interest rates had not gone down so much. And indeed, if the ECB had already introduced owner-occupied housing into the measure of HICP, it would be between 1 and 1.5% higher than it already is. In response to Stephanie's question, of course, I don't think that we're going to get back to negative interest rates, minus 50 basis points, because as Ottmar has said, and as I wrote in my book, the structural change is really quite dramatic. Over the last 30 years, we had extraordinarily favorable disinflationary support from globalization, China becoming the workshop of the world, and the demographic trends, which were, again, dramatic. And these are now changing very sharply. The next 30 years are going to be very different from the last 30 years. Labor is going to recover its bargaining power, and that means that the basic underlying structure of the system will be more inflationary. And that, unfortunately, means that to maintain the 2% inflation target, that nominal and real interest rates will have to be higher over the next 30 years than they have been over the last 30 years. And that is going to mean that instead of being best friends of ministers of finance, there's going to be a considerable degree of conflict between central bankers and ministers of finance. And quite how that will play out over time, we have yet to see. It will be very interesting.
Well, thanks for that. And we now have a question for Professor Moll, who's coming from Lucas Carbonese, who's a rather long question, so I will do my best to try to present it concisely. He says, standard economic principle is that it is easier to substitute towards alternative sources as time goes by, which should indeed ameliorate economic-wide losses from these potential energy embargo by the time we get to the second half of 2022 or in 2023. At the same time, continuing the embargo may create additional economic-wide losses due to foregone investment in physical capital, but also productivity declines. Do you think that output losses and inflationary pressures from an energy embargo will be larger in the medium run rather than in the short term? And if yes, is an EU commitment to future embargo policies credible? And I also have a question of my own to you. In your presentation, which we had to cut short a little bit, your main point was that right now there's an issue with political will to get this done. And I look at a country like Germany, which has 3 big shocks happening at the same time. They have to go greener. They have an issue with cheap energy coming from Russia. That's not going to be the case. And then they have essentially a demand problem from China, given 10 years of made in Germany, let's sell it over to China, that's our foreign policy. Is that the big obstacle perhaps here, this triple adjustment for Germany? That's why they're dragging their feet, rather than the actual impact that it would have on the short term? That's my question. It's a lot to unpack, but...
Great, thank you. 2 excellent questions. So let me first take Lucas's question, and 3 points, I guess. So the first one is, yes, 100%, I think all economists would agree that, you know, the more time passes, the more substitutability that is. That's sort of one of the key concepts of economics. So we looked at the empirical literature, and this force seems to be quite strong, sort of, in particular for gas, sort of within sort of 2 years, you could probably substitute a lot of the gas. Also, the sort of more downstream products, you could substitute a lot. The second thing is, there have been plenty of follow-up studies since we wrote our paper that exactly take into account these effects that Lucas is worried about, which is effects on capital accumulation and investment and so on. And they kind of all confirm our basic numbers, at least in sort of the order of magnitude. So there is essentially no serious study that gets a larger than 5% GDP loss, and you know that's taking into account all these effects. And then the third thing is, you know, if one is worried about these costs being too large, then which I can definitely sort of see, then one good option is exactly a tariff. So the nice thing about a tariff, right, is sort of you can sort of calibrate the cost up and down. If you just do a small tariff, I guess the cost won't be too large, and if, as you increase the tariff more and more towards 100%, it's basically going to morph into a full embargo. So you can kind of use this policy tool if you think the costs are too large. This sort of then also morphs into my answer to your question, Maria, which is, yes, 100%. I mean, you know, look, these are not easy times. I sort of said all our numbers are relative to a baseline in which, you know, there's no embargo. If you think that this baseline is highly problematic and there's sort of these 3 shocks hitting the economy even in that baseline, I guess, you know, it could make political sense that you'd think that, you know, it's just too costly to then put a 4th shock on top of these 3 shocks, essentially. Yeah, so, but again, then I think then the good policy tool, if you're worried about that, is a tariff, essentially. And then the final thing, I guess, is sort of, it's a matter of political communication. You know, if politicians in Germany and elsewhere just said, look, there's already these 3 shocks, I don't want to put another 3% GDP loss on top of that, I could get behind that. I mean, that'd be fine. But instead they say the lights would go out, there would be mass unemployment and poverty, and millions of lost jobs. And I think that's just, you know, it doesn't make much sense if you think about it. And so, you know, I just wish there were more honesty in the communication, essentially.
So more nuanced debate. And we're reaching the end of our session, but I have a final question for Mr. Lane. Of course, whenever you normalize policy, that implies volatility. It's a time of changes. For a lot of people out there, this is almost the end of this whatever it takes kind of era that the ECB had. When you look at the scenario that we're in, where you have a war, where you have potentially some type of energy embargo never done before, a lot of political uncertainty, all of these huge changes happening at the same time, do you go, God, we're having to normalize the worst time to do it? I mean, we've put ourselves in a very tricky spot. It's difficult to do it in this context.
We essentially started last December, and we emphasized step by step. So we had a deceleration in the pace of purchases under PEP. We brought PEP to an end. We revised down the APP, and we're close to bringing APP to an end. So, I mean, if you, from the perspective of last December, the idea of step by step of gradualism, but a lot of that is now converging to, it is going to be a new regime. When we have the active policy tool being just the policy rate, that's a much more flexible instrument. I mean, the machinery of QE is quite something, and we did have to bring it to an end in a step-by-step way. To say in an unannounced way we're going to have a big pivot, I think could have been a little bit problematic. That's coming to an end. Now we're going to have the policy rate, and what we've emphasised is gradualism, flexibility, optionality, but in the end, whatever we need to do to stabilise inflation at 2%. And so the debate here has emphasised some risks more than other risks, and we will be as attentive as possible in making the pathway. And what I said is the initial steps are clear and they're robust. So on the different conjectures about what we should do, it's robust to make those initial steps. After that, it's going to be, I think, very much which of the forces we've talked about will dominate.
And of course, markets and investors always pay attention to what you say, and they take a lot of, perhaps at times, comfort too in your words. So I'm sure that's the case today again. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, all of you, for your time and for being here in Madrid for this book award and this great prize that, it's one of the most prestigious in Spain. So you're greatly appreciated coming here, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you all.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Lane, Mr.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Guerra, Professor Ma, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. See you very soon. Mr.